"Bring her to me," the Alpha King ordered, his voice carrying through the hall like a steel bell. For a moment, every wolf in the chamber moved at once, obeying before they even understood why. At the far edge of the room, beneath the pale spill of torchlight, a young Omega stood with her head lowered, trying to make herself small enough to disappear. Her sleeves were tugged down over her wrists. Her hair had been hastily pinned back. Even from across the hall, it was clear she was shaking. Not from defiance. From the effort of staying upright. The Alpha King had been expecting silence, perhaps fear, perhaps the usual lowered gaze and trembling apologies that came from anyone brought before him without warning. Instead, when his eyes found her, something inside him went very still. Bruised. Not hidden, not disguised, not the kind of mark a person could explain away with a careless excuse. Her cheek bore a fading shadow near the jawline. One wrist had a dark smear beneath the cuff. Her posture was careful, almost practiced, as if she had learned how to stand in pain without asking anyone to notice. And that was what made his control slip. He took one step forward. Then another. The room seemed to tighten around him, every conversation dying at once. The Omega did not lift her eyes. She seemed to understand, in some instinctive way, that looking up might make things worse. Her breathing was shallow, measured, the kind a person used when they were trying not to cry in front of strangers. The Alpha King felt the old, hard instinct in his chest sharpen into something far less forgiving. He had ordered her brought to him because he had been told she was troublesome, disobedient, a girl who did not know her place. He had been told she answered too softly, moved too quietly, and refused to bow the way others expected. But the woman standing before him did not look troublesome. She looked worn down by a world that had mistaken her silence for weakness. He stopped only a few feet away. Up close, the signs were worse. A bruise darkened at the edge of her collarbone. A thin cut had dried at the corner of her lip, not fresh enough to alarm the court, but enough to tell him the truth. Someone had hurt her and expected the world to keep turning. Someone had believed she would never be noticed. His jaw tightened. "Who did this?" he asked, but the question landed in the silence like a warning. No one answered. The hall held its breath. The Omega's fingers curled once at her side, then relaxed. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "It doesn't matter, Your Majesty." It mattered. The simple answer hit him harder than any shout would have. It mattered because no one should sound that resigned. It mattered because she had already learned how to expect less. It mattered because the sight of her standing there, bruised and trying not to be seen, made something deep and dangerous rise in him. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as an inconvenience, not as a rumor, not as a name spoken by servants in passing. A person. A young woman holding herself together with more dignity than the room deserved. "It matters to me," he said, lower now, his voice stripped of command and edged with something raw. Her lashes trembled. For the first time, she looked up. Not boldly. Not with challenge. Just enough for him to catch the fear she had hidden so carefully. And in that single glance, the Alpha King lost the last of his control. He did not move for several breaths. The hall around them seemed to dim, as if every torch had lowered its flame to watch him. The Omega's face was still tilted toward him, carefully guarded, as though even that small act of trust had cost her something. Bruises marked the pale skin beneath her collar, not fresh enough to alarm the entire room, but impossible to ignore now that his eyes had found them. His jaw tightened. Not with rage that looked for an outlet. Not with the cold, controlled fury the court feared. This was quieter. Sharper. The kind that settled deep and changed the air. "Who did this?" he asked. The question came out soft, and that made it more dangerous. Around them, nobles shifted in their places. No one answered at first. A lady near the front lowered her gaze. A steward swallowed hard. Somewhere behind them, a voice tried to speak too quickly, too brightly. Your Majesty, it is nothing more than a misunderstanding. She is only a servant girl from the outer cottages. She became clumsy and the rest vanished when the Alpha King turned his head. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. Even the music at the edge of the hall seemed to die in its own throat. The young woman flinched, as if she had been punished for another person's words before. That tiny reaction struck him harder than the bruises. She was waiting. Still waiting for blame. Still waiting for dismissal. His hands curled once at his sides. Then he stepped forward, closing the distance between them with measured restraint. Not enough to crowd her. Just enough that she could feel he had chosen to come closer. "Look at me," he said. She hesitated, then obeyed. Her eyes were tired in a way no young woman should ever have to be. Not empty. Not broken. Just worn down by too many moments of being told she was less than she was. He felt something in his chest pull tight. Behind him, the court watched in frozen disbelief as the king lowered his voice until it belonged only to her. "You will not stand here and pretend nothing matters when I can see the truth on your skin." Her lips parted slightly. For a second, she looked as if she might argue, as if apology had become her first language. But no words came. The room itself seemed to wait for her to speak, yet she only drew a careful breath and held it like a secret. He understood then that she had learned to survive by making herself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. That kind of survival could turn even kindness into a threat. His gaze shifted to the attendants by the wall. "Fetch water," he ordered. "And a healer." The response was immediate, but the palace servants moved with visible unease, as though obedience had become a sharp edge. He watched the Omega start to bow her head again, and before she could disappear into herself, he said, "Do not." The single word stopped her. Not harshly. Not as command alone. As a refusal to let her vanish. Her lashes lifted. Confusion flickered there, followed by a fragile kind of hope so faint it almost broke him. In that moment, he realized the danger was no longer in the room. It was in him. Because once he had seen her like this, bruised and trying not to be seen, there would be no returning to the distance he had once kept. And when a noblewoman finally found her voice and murmured that the girl had probably provoked trouble herself, the Alpha King's expression changed so completely that every wolf in the chamber felt it. His calm did not shatter. It deepened. "No one here will speak of her that way again," he said. Then, with the court staring in stunned silence, he extended his hand toward the trembling Omega and waited, as if the entire world had suddenly become less important than whether she would trust him enough to take it. The chamber had gone still, but the silence was not empty. It pressed against every wall, heavy with the kind of attention that made a person feel exposed down to the bone. The Omega stood where he had left her, shoulders drawn in, one hand hovering near the torn edge of her sleeve as if she could make herself smaller by force alone. She had likely spent her whole life learning how to survive in rooms like this. Rooms where eyes lingered too long. Rooms where whispers became judgments. Rooms where kindness came too late, if it came at all. The Alpha King noticed all of it at once, and it unsettled him more than the court itself. Not because she looked fragile. Fragility could be dismissed. It was the restraint in her posture, the way she kept her breathing even despite the heat in the room, the way she refused to collapse even now, that struck something deep in him. It was the look of someone who had been hurt often enough to expect it again, and had still chosen not to become cruel. A nobleman near the front shifted and cleared his throat as though to speak, but the Alpha King did not turn. His gaze remained on her face. She had lowered her eyes again, though not before he caught the brief flicker of uncertainty there. She did not trust the silence. She probably thought it was only the calm before another humiliation. The thought hit him with a force that made his chest tighten. "Come here," he said at last, but his voice had changed. It was no longer the hard command that had frozen the hall earlier. It was lower now, controlled, almost careful, as if he understood that one wrong edge in his tone might send her retreating again. The Omega did not move. Not because she was defiant. Because fear had taught her to wait for the next blow. He saw that too. He lifted his hand a little higher, not demanding, only offering, and something in her expression shifted, small and trembling, like a door opening the width of a breath. Then she took one step. It was barely anything. Yet the entire room seemed to feel it. Her foot touched the marble, and the sound was so light it seemed impossible that a life could change from such a small motion. The Alpha King watched her approach with the intensity of a man witnessing a miracle he had never expected to deserve. When she stopped before him, she did not look up. Her hands were clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles had gone pale. He could feel the strain in her silence, the effort it cost her simply to stand in his presence without shaking apart. Slowly, he reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cold. Not cold from the room, but from habit, from fear, from a life spent bracing against whatever came next. His thumb moved once over her knuckles, a small, grounding gesture that made her inhale sharply. Around them, the court seemed to hold its breath. He could feel every stare, every question, every silent challenge waiting for him to explain why this girl mattered. But he no longer cared about their judgment. The bruises he had seen were enough to make every polished face in that hall seem distasteful. He looked at her hand in his, then back to her bowed head, and something in him settled into place with terrifying certainty. This was not a passing irritation. This was not curiosity. This was recognition. She had been standing in his path all along, and the world had tried to make her invisible. He would not allow it. Her lips parted as though she might apologize, and he tightened his hold just enough to stop the words before they could leave her. "Do not apologize for surviving," he said, so quietly that only she could hear it. That sentence seemed to strike her harder than any harsh word could have. Her eyes lifted at last, wide and uncertain, shining with a hurt she had no name for. And in that fragile, unguarded look, the Alpha King understood that he was already too late to remain distant. He had seen her. Truly seen her. And once that happened, there was no pretending otherwise. He kept hold of her hand for one brief second longer than he should have, as if letting go would mean admitting the truth that had already taken root in his chest. The court remained frozen around them, every noble face turned sharp with curiosity, every elder wolf silent in the uneasy way of people who had just witnessed something they could not explain. The Omega was still trembling, but not from the room now. It was from him. From the fact that the Alpha King had looked at her bruises and not turned away. From the fact that he had spoken to her as though her pain mattered. She seemed to realize, all at once, that the danger had shifted. Not vanished. Shifted. That strange certainty made her swallow hard and lower her eyes again, though her fingers had not yet fully released his. The king noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed the way she tried to hide the instinct to shrink, the way she held herself like someone expecting disappointment the moment kindness arrived. It unsettled him more than the whispers ever could. Around them, the room began to breathe again in small, careful motions. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else looked away. But no one spoke. They were waiting for him to return to the role they understood, the one built from command and fear and distance. Instead, he turned slightly, still facing her, and his voice came out low and steady. "Who did this to you?" The question was not loud, but it struck the hall harder than shouting would have. The Omega's lips parted. For a moment she looked as if she might deny it, might protect someone else even now, might carry pain like a duty she had never been allowed to set down. That possibility tightened something deep inside him. Before she could answer, one of the court attendants stepped forward too quickly, hands clasped together, face pale. "Your Majesty, she is nothing more than a stray taken in from the lower quarter. She is not fit to stand before you like this." The words were meant to dismiss her, to reduce her back into silence. Instead, they fell into the chamber like stones. The Alpha King did not even look at the attendant at first. His attention stayed on the Omega, on the faint bruise near her wrist, on the careful way she had gone still as if she had learned long ago how to endure insult without flinching. "Nothing more?" he asked softly. The attendant swallowed. The king finally turned his head, and when his gaze landed on the man, the entire room seemed to cool. "Say that again," he said, calm enough to be frightening, "and remind me why you still think you belong in my court." No one moved. Not a single wolf dared interrupt the quiet that followed. The Omega stood in the center of it all, stunned by the sudden change, as if she had stepped into a dream that had not yet decided whether to be merciful. The Alpha King looked back at her, and the hardness in his eyes gave way to something unguarded, something almost pained. He had expected many things when he ordered her brought to him. Fear, perhaps. Defiance. Silence. But not this. Not the sight of her standing there with marks she had clearly tried to hide, as though her suffering was an inconvenience she had no right to name. He felt anger rise, clean and cold, but beneath it was something far more dangerous. A need to protect. "You will not speak to her that way," he said, his voice carrying now, steady enough for every corner of the hall to hear. Then, to the Omega, he lowered it again, gentler than anyone in the room had likely ever heard from him. "No one here will touch you again unless you allow it." The promise hung between them, quiet and absolute. For the first time, the Omega looked directly at him, and what he saw in her eyes was not trust. Trust was too large, too fragile. It was something smaller, more delicate, a cautious flicker that had survived too many disappointments. Yet it was there. And in that tiny spark, the king understood that whatever came next, the world around them would not remain the same. The Omega had barely found her footing before the silence in the hall began to shift. It was subtle at first, like the breath before a storm, a change in the air that made every wolf straighten without understanding why. The Alpha King still held her hand, though only lightly now, as if he had realized too late how much that single gesture revealed. Around them, the court watched in rigid stillness. Some looked away. Some stared. A few seemed almost offended that he had given her such careful attention, as if tenderness itself were a breach of law. The Omega felt all of it. She felt the weight of their eyes, the heat rising in her face, the painful awareness of the bruises hidden beneath the fabric she had chosen so carefully. She had dressed to disappear. She had walked into this hall hoping to remain unnoticed, to survive the day without becoming anyone's reason for gossip. But now there was no hiding. Not with the king looking at her as though he could see every wound she had ever carried. "Who did this to you?" he asked at last. His voice was low, but it cut through the room with unmistakable force. The question was simple. The answer was not. The Omega's throat tightened. She did not want to answer. Not here. Not in front of all these wolves who had already learned to look through her as though she were nothing. Her silence seemed to say enough. The king's jaw flexed once. Something dark passed through his eyes, not fury exactly, but the kind of controlled anger that made even seasoned nobles lower their gazes. He did not touch her this time. He only stepped half a pace closer, giving her the first choice anyone had offered her all night. "You do not need to protect anyone here," he said, quieter now, for her alone. Not for their comfort. Not for their pride. Those words landed somewhere deep inside her, unsettling in their gentleness. No one had ever spoken to her as if her pain mattered more than someone else's reputation. No one had ever made room for her fear without demanding she make herself smaller in return. Her fingers curled against the edge of her sleeve. For one brief second, she looked as though she might still retreat into herself. Then she lifted her chin just enough to meet his gaze. Not boldly. Not as an equal yet. But with the careful courage of someone who had been wounded too many times to trust the air around her. "I fell," she said softly. The lie sounded thin in the stillness. Even she could hear that much. The king did not challenge it. He only looked at her a moment longer, reading what she would not say. Bruises did not appear from a fall. Not in places hidden by cloth. Not in the pattern of a hand. The realization moved through him like ice. He turned, slowly, toward the room. The nobles stiffened before he even spoke. "Bring the healer," he said. "And clear the chamber." A murmur swept through the court, startled and uncertain. The order was not shouted. It did not need to be. It carried the finality of law. Chairs scraped back. Faces paled. Even the elders began to move, all of them suddenly eager to obey. Yet the Omega remained where she was, frozen by the strange mercy of being seen so completely and so publicly. When the hall began to empty, the king did not release her from his attention. He stood between her and the retreating crowd, a silent barrier that felt more protective than any wall. Then, in a voice that was meant to reach those still lingering at the doors, he said, "No one leaves this hall with the right to say they did not notice her." The words struck harder than any accusation. The Omega's breath caught. Her eyes stung, though she refused to let the tears fall. This was not what she had expected. Not pity. Not suspicion. Certainly not this impossible, terrible sense that the ground beneath her was changing. For the first time in her life, silence was not being used to erase her. It was being used to expose everyone who had looked away. And when the Alpha King turned back to her, his expression no longer held only anger. It held something deeper, more dangerous, and far less controlled. A decision. One she had not yet earned, but perhaps had already begun to deserve. By the time the hall had emptied by half, the Omega could feel every lingering gaze like a weight on her shoulders. She kept her chin lowered, not because she had nothing to say, but because experience had taught her that the wrong word could turn mercy into mockery. The Alpha King remained near her, one hand resting behind his back, his posture still as carved stone, yet his attention never drifted from her face. It was unsettling in a way she did not have a name for. Not cruel. Not cold. Simply impossible to ignore. The servants moved carefully along the edges of the chamber, collecting spilled cups and straightening fallen ribbons, but no one came close enough to interrupt the space that had formed around them. It felt almost sacred, though she would have never dared to call it that. Her wrist still tingled where he had held her, and the strange warmth of that touch clung to her skin like a secret she had not agreed to keep. She swallowed, trying to steady her breathing. He had defended her once in front of the court. That alone should have felt like enough. It should have. But the king was not finished with looking at her, and each second of his silence made her more aware of the bruises hidden beneath the sleeve of her dress, of the stiff way she stood, of every painful reminder that her body had already endured more than it should have. At last, he spoke, and his voice was lower now, stripped of the edge it had carried before. "Who did this to you?" The question was simple. Too simple. Yet it landed between them like something sharp. Her throat tightened. She did not answer at first. That was its own answer, and they both knew it. A faint muscle moved in his jaw. Not anger at her. Never that. Something colder. More focused. "You do not have to protect anyone here," he said. "Not today." The words loosened something in her chest she had spent years holding closed. Still, she did not know what frightened her more, the kindness in his tone, or the fact that it felt genuine. She had learned to distrust softness when it appeared too suddenly. Softness could hide disappointment. It could hide interest that faded. It could hide pity dressed as concern. Yet his eyes did none of those things. They stayed on her as though he were reading the truth she had spent her entire life trying to bury. Around them, the last of the court withdrew toward the doors. Their footsteps faded into a distant murmur, leaving the chamber quieter, more private, and far more dangerous than before. The Omega felt herself becoming acutely aware of every breath she took. In that silence, she could hear the faint crackle of torch fire, the rustle of fabric, the slow, measured rhythm of his breathing. He was waiting. Not commanding. Not forcing. Waiting. It was perhaps the most disarming thing anyone had ever done to her. Her fingers curled against her palm. The bruise on her forearm throbbed under the sleeve, and without meaning to, she drew that arm closer to her body. His gaze followed the movement at once. Something in him tightened. She saw it, quick and controlled, but unmistakable. "Please," she began, though she was not certain what she was asking for. Mercy. Distance. Time. She did not know. He stepped forward just enough to make the air change between them. Then he stopped. "No more please," he said quietly. "Not when you are standing in my hall." Her breath caught at that. My hall. The words should have sounded possessive. Instead, they sounded like a promise that the world had not yet had the right to make to her. He glanced toward the doors once, then back to her. When he spoke again, there was no room left for doubt. "You will be seen," he said. "You will be heard. And until I am satisfied that every person in this place understands what they failed to notice, you will not be left alone with their whispers." For the first time, she looked up fully. The king saw the hesitation in her eyes, the small wariness that had survived every kindness she had ever been offered. He did not mistake it for refusal. He only noticed it, and that alone made the air feel heavy in a different way. Then, with a deliberate care that made the moment feel larger than the room itself, he removed his cloak and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was warm from his body. Heavy. Real. It settled over her like shelter, like evidence, like something no one could pretend away. She stared down at it, stunned by the simple impossibility of being covered without being shamed. When she looked up again, he was still watching her, his expression unreadable except for one thing. Resolve. Not the kind that demanded. The kind that stayed. And as the final voices faded beyond the hall, the Omega realized with a quiet, shaking certainty that this was no longer about one public moment or one defended insult. Something had shifted. Not enough to call it safety. Not yet. But enough to make leaving impossible. By morning, the palace had begun to feel less like a throne room and more like a place holding its breath. Word traveled faster than footsteps in those halls, and even the servants lowered their voices when they passed the corridor where she had stood the night before. The Omega noticed it in small things first. The way heads turned and then quickly faced forward. The way a conversation would fade the moment she entered. The way people who had once looked through her now looked at her as if she had become a question no one knew how to answer. She kept her gaze lowered and her steps quiet, carrying the kind of caution that came from a life spent learning how quickly kindness could become ridicule. But the cloak still rested around her shoulders, and that one simple weight reminded her that something had changed, even if she did not yet know what it meant. The Alpha King had not spoken much after the hall emptied. He had not needed to. His presence had said enough. He had stayed near her longer than court protocol would ever allow, and each moment of his silence had felt more deliberate than a speech. Now, in the pale morning light, that same silence followed him as he crossed the great receiving chamber. He did not look tired. He looked focused, as if the world had narrowed to a single point and everything else had become background noise. When his advisors approached, bowing low and speaking in careful tones, he barely reacted. His attention kept drifting, not away from the room, but toward the far end where she stood waiting to be dismissed. She had been told to remain until further notice. No one had explained why. That alone was enough to make her shoulders tense. The Alpha King finally turned, and the chamber seemed to tighten around the movement. His eyes found her immediately. Not the way a ruler might inspect a subject. Not the way a man might glance at something pleasing and then look away. He looked at her as if he was checking whether she was still there, still breathing, still carrying the weight of last night without breaking beneath it. The Omega felt the heat rise in her face and immediately hated herself for it. She had never known what to do with attention that did not come with a price. Come here, he said, and the room heard it. His voice was calm, but it left no room for debate. She moved before she had time to think better of it, each step careful, each breath shallow. When she stopped in front of him, she kept her hands folded at her waist. The king's gaze dropped for a brief moment to the place where bruises still marked the edge of her wrist. The change in his expression was so slight that anyone else might have missed it. But she saw it. A tightening at the jaw. A stillness that sharpened the air. He said nothing at first. He only reached out, slowly, as if giving her every chance to pull away, and lifted the edge of the cloak where it had slipped. His fingers did not touch her skin. They did not need to. The care itself was enough to unsettle her. Who did this? He asked at last. The question was quiet. Too quiet. That made it more frightening than anger would have been. Her throat tightened. She knew the answer would not help her. It would only bring more attention, and attention had never been kind to her. So she hesitated. Just a second too long. The Alpha King noticed. Of course he did. His gaze sharpened, but not with impatience. With something closer to understanding. You do not have to protect people who harmed you, he said, each word measured, as if he were speaking to a wound that had already gone deep. She looked down at the marble floor, because looking at him felt too much like standing in open light. No one had ever spoken to her that way before. Not as if her silence mattered. Not as if her pain deserved a name. The chamber remained still around them. Even the advisors had gone silent, sensing the shape of something important unfolding without knowing what it was. The Omega swallowed hard and forced herself to answer. Her voice came out softer than she wanted, but it held. It was nothing, she said. The lie was small. Familiar. Safe. Or it should have been. But something in the Alpha King's face changed at once, as if those two words had struck him harder than a confession would have. He stepped closer. Not enough to crowd her. Enough to make it impossible for her to pretend he had not heard her. Nothing does not leave marks, he said. Her breath caught. The room went still in a different way now. More focused. More dangerous. He had seen the bruises. He had heard the lie. And he had decided that neither would be ignored. When he turned slightly, his voice carried to the nearest guard with a force that made the air seem to snap into place. Find out who brought her here in that condition. The guard bowed at once and disappeared. The Omega's pulse jumped. She did not know whether to fear what would happen next or hope for it. The king looked back at her, and there was no softness in his expression now, only an intensity that made her feel exposed and protected at the same time. Until I know the truth, he said, you will not be sent anywhere alone. She stared at him, stunned by the simple certainty of it. Not pity. Not charity. A decision. A boundary placed around her like a wall meant to keep the world out. For the first time, she did not know how to shrink from it. And that frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. Because somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the disbelief, a quiet and dangerous feeling had begun to grow. The kind that made a heart remember what it had long forgotten. That being seen could hurt. And still, somehow, it could also heal. By the time the lamps were lit across the upper corridor, the palace had settled into that strange, watchful silence that came before a storm. The Omega stood near the window in a borrowed cloak, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. She had been told to wait there, and so she waited, listening to the soft shuffle of servants beyond the door and the distant murmur of a kingdom trying very hard not to stare. She did not need to see their faces to feel the shape of their curiosity. It pressed in on her from every side. Not all of it was cruel. That was the part she did not know how to carry. Mercy was harder to understand than mockery. The king had not spoken to her since morning, but his orders still hung in the air like a held breath. No one would send her away alone. No one would question what had brought her to the palace. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it made her chest ache with the dangerous weight of being noticed. Down the hall, voices rose and softened again, then fell completely quiet. The king had returned. She knew it before the door opened, before the guards straightened, before the room seemed to gather itself around his presence. When he stepped inside, the air changed with him. He did not look at anyone else first. His eyes found her at once, and something unreadable moved through his expression, quick and deep. Not anger now. Not only that. Concern, perhaps. Or something close enough to unsettle her. "Leave us," he said, and the attendants moved without hesitation. The door closed behind them, and suddenly the room felt too large for just the two of them. He crossed the floor with measured steps, then stopped a few feet away, as if he were still deciding how much distance she could bear. Up close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the fatigue that had not been there the night before, the way his control seemed to be held together by effort rather than ease. He had the kind of stillness that made people obey before he even raised his voice. Yet when he looked at her, that stillness became something more personal, almost rough around the edges. "Who did this to you?" he asked. The question was quiet. That made it worse. She lowered her gaze at once, because answering meant opening a door she had spent years trying to keep shut. Her silence stretched between them. He did not fill it. He waited. That, too, was new. At last, her voice came out small and unsteady. "It does not matter now." His eyes sharpened. "It matters to me." The words landed with a force she was not prepared for. She looked up then, just for a moment, and saw that he meant them. Not as a promise made for show. Not as a phrase meant to calm a frightened girl. It was a statement of fact. A line drawn where the world had failed to draw one before. The Omega swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight, and for a moment she hated how close she was to breaking from something as simple as being asked the truth. Before she could answer, the door opened again. One of the older servants entered with her head bowed, carrying a folded report and a tray of warmed tea that had long gone untouched. She glanced between them once, then placed the papers on the table and retreated just as quickly. The king picked up the report. His eyes moved over the page, once, twice, and then the room seemed to darken around the force of his silence. He set the paper down with care, too much care, and the Omega felt the change before he even spoke. "This is not an accident," he said. She did not move. The king's gaze returned to her, steady and unsettling. "You were brought here with intent." Her pulse stumbled. A cold thread ran down her spine, but before fear could take hold, something else followed it. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The king stepped closer, and this time he did not stop at a careful distance. He reached for the edge of her cloak, not to pull it away, but to adjust it over her shoulder with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. The touch was brief. Controlled. Almost reverent. It frightened her more than any roughness could have. Because it carried a truth she was only beginning to understand. He was not simply protecting her because she was fragile. He was protecting her because he had seen enough to know she had been made fragile by others. And that difference changed everything. "You will remain here," he said, voice low and absolute. "Until I know who brought you to my gates, no one touches your path, your name, or your future." The Omega stared at him, caught between disbelief and something perilously close to surrender. The palace around them remained still, but inside her, something had begun to stir with painful, impossible life. For the first time in a very long time, the world was not asking her to disappear. It was waiting to see what she would become when someone finally refused to let her be erased. The palace was quieter than the Omega had ever heard it, as if every stone in its walls had decided to listen. Outside the tall windows, dusk had given way to a velvet night, and the lanterns along the corridor cast a soft gold across the floor where she stood waiting in her borrowed cloak. Her fingers were still folded tightly together, but the trembling in them had lessened. Not because the fear was gone. It was because something else had taken root beside it. A fragile, dangerous hope. When the door finally opened, she lifted her head at once. The Alpha King entered without ceremony, his expression unreadable at first, his presence filling the room with the same quiet force as a storm held just beyond the horizon. Behind him came two attendants carrying folded fabric, a small carved box, and a thin stack of sealed papers tied with a silver cord. The sight of them made her pulse quicken. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring not her body, but the distance the world had forced between who she was and how she had been treated. "The house will be ready for you by morning," he said at last. His voice was steady, but not cold. "You will not be placed in the outer rooms. You will have your own space, your own staff, and your own name spoken correctly in this palace." The words landed softly, and somehow that made them hit deeper. Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken about her future as something that belonged to her. Before she could answer, he nodded once toward the attendants, and they set the items down with careful hands before retreating to the door. The Alpha King crossed the room and opened the carved box himself. Inside rested a simple silver brooch shaped like a crescent moon, polished until it caught the lantern light. He held it up, not with pride, but with a strange sort of restraint, as though even a small gift required honesty from him. "This is not a charm," he said. "It is a sign. If anyone speaks over you, they will know you stand under my protection." She stared at the brooch, then at him, unable to hide the shock in her face. He noticed it, and for the first time, the corner of his mouth shifted as if he almost smiled. Almost. Then his expression sobered again. "And there is something else." He lifted the sealed papers from the table and broke the cord with one precise motion. "Your name was recorded incorrectly at the gate. Your lineage was hidden, whether by mistake or by design, and I do not like unanswered questions in my kingdom." The Omega felt the floor tilt beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Her past, the one she had been taught to swallow quietly, was being pulled into the light by his hands. He read the top page, then the second, his gaze narrowing with each line. The silence stretched so long that she could hear the faint crackle of the lamp. Finally, he looked up. Not at the papers. At her. And something in his face changed. It was subtle, but it was unmistakable. Recognition. Not of a title. Of a wound. Of the shape of a life that had been hidden too long. "Who did this to you?" he asked, and there was no anger in the question this time. Only a terrible, controlled calm. She could not speak at first. Her lips parted, but her breath caught on the memory of every door that had closed, every name that had been shortened into insult, every time she had been made to feel too small to matter. The Alpha King waited. He did not push. He only stood there in the lantern glow, a powerful man with a kingdom at his back and patience in his eyes, as if he had suddenly become the one person in the world willing to let her tell the truth at her own pace. At last, her voice came out thin, but steady enough to carry. "My own people," she whispered. The room went still. Not dramatically. Not with spectacle. Just with the awful quiet that follows a truth too heavy to ignore. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would speak in fury. Instead, he set the papers down with deliberate care and moved closer until there was only a short breath of space between them. "Then they will answer for it," he said. His words were not loud. They did not need to be. They were the kind that altered the air itself. The Omega's eyes burned, and she turned her face away before tears could fall, ashamed of how much the promise moved her. But the Alpha King noticed anyway. He always seemed to notice. He reached up then, slow enough for her to stop him, and with 2 fingers he lifted the edge of her cloak and placed the crescent moon brooch against the fabric near her shoulder. His touch was brief, almost ceremonial, yet it shook her more deeply than anything before. "You will not be hidden again," he said. "Not by this kingdom. Not by anyone who thought silence could make you disappear." She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw that the control he wore so carefully was not absence of feeling. It was the effort of containing too much of it. The realization made her chest ache in a new way. The fear had not vanished. The palace was still a palace, and kings were still kings. But for the first time, she was beginning to understand that power did not always arrive like a blade. Sometimes it arrived like a hand held out in the dark. Somewhere beyond the corridor, bells began to ring softly through the night, marking the hour before dawn. The Alpha King turned toward the window, then back to her, and in that quiet turn there was the beginning of a vow neither of them had yet spoken aloud. By morning, the kingdom would know her name. By morning, the people who had tried to bury her would learn what it meant when a king chose to remember. And standing beneath the pale lantern light, with the moon brooch resting over her heart, the Omega finally understood that being seen was no longer the end of her story. It was the beginning of everything. By dawn, the palace had changed in ways no one could have named out loud. The corridors still gleamed with polished stone and gold, the banners still hung in their careful silence, but something in the air had shifted. It was no longer the silence of fear alone. It was the silence of attention. The kind that followed a name after it had been spoken in the wrong room, then carried through every wall until even the servants walked softer, and the nobles straightened when she passed. The Omega felt it in every step she took beside the Alpha King, his presence calm at her shoulder, his gaze dark and steady whenever the world around them grew too sharp. She did not know how to move like someone who belonged among power. Every instinct she had ever learned told her to shrink, to apologize for taking up space, to make herself small enough to survive. But each time she tried, she found him there, silent and unshaken, as if he had decided that her place in the world was not something to be negotiated by anyone else. When they entered the morning council chamber, the room grew still. Men who had spent years speaking over one another and across her kind now lowered their eyes. A few looked surprised. A few looked uneasy. One or two looked ashamed. The Omega kept her hands folded before her, her bruises hidden beneath the sleeves of the borrowed cloak that now hung from her shoulders like a promise she had not yet learned to trust. The Alpha King spoke first, and his voice did not rise. It did not need to. "She will remain under my protection," he said. "No one touches her. No one questions her. And no one forgets who she is." The words landed like warm fire in a room full of frost. For a moment, no one answered. Then an older advisor with silver at his temples bowed his head and said, with obvious effort, "As your majesty commands." The Omega felt her breath catch. Not because the words were grand. Because they were real. Not a gesture. Not pity. A command. A boundary. A line drawn clearly enough for even the proudest wolves to see. The Alpha King turned slightly, just enough for her to feel the weight of his attention without forcing her to meet it. "Come," he said quietly. "There is somewhere I want to show you." He led her away from the council chamber and through a narrow corridor lined with tall windows. Morning light poured through the glass in pale gold bands, falling across the floor and catching in the dust that drifted lazily between them. The palace, so overwhelming at first, began to feel less like a cage and more like a place with hidden doors. He stopped at the end of the hall before a balcony overlooking the inner gardens. Below them, pale white flowers moved in the wind, their petals opening toward the sun as if they had been waiting all night for this very hour. The Omega stood beside the stone railing, the breeze lifting a loose strand of hair across her cheek. For a while neither of them spoke. The quiet was not uncomfortable. It was careful. Respectful. Almost tender. Then the Alpha King said, without looking away from the garden, "You do not need to thank me every time someone shows you the dignity you should have always been given." His words made something painful and bright rise behind her eyes. She swallowed hard. "I have not known what to do with kindness," she admitted, the confession so small it nearly broke her. He finally looked at her then, and in his gaze there was none of the sharp hunger she had feared from powerful men. Only something patient. something that looked almost like grief. "Then you may learn," he said. The breeze moved between them. Somewhere far below, a fountain caught the sunlight and flashed like silver. The Omega lowered her eyes, but not before he saw the tremor in her mouth, the way she fought not to cry simply because she was being spoken to gently. It was a strange thing, he realized, to watch someone brace for cruelty even while standing in the shelter of his protection. Stranger still to feel an unfamiliar, protective anger stir in his chest when he thought of how many times she must have been made to doubt her own worth. He had seen fear before. He had seen defiance, ambition, greed, and deceit. But this was different. This was the aftermath of being broken by voices that should have never had the right to wound her. "Look at me," he said softly. She obeyed, slowly. The morning light touched her face then, and for the first time he saw her clearly without the shadows of the hall or the shame of the crowd. Bruises marked her skin in places hidden beneath fabric and careful movement, small reminders of injuries someone had chosen to ignore. His jaw tightened, not with rage that needed to be shown, but with a restrained certainty that made the air feel heavier. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, with a steadiness that made her chest ache, he lifted one hand, stopped just short of touching her cheek, and waited. The Omega's breath faltered. She did not know why the simple pause felt more intimate than any touch could have been. It was the waiting that undid her. The permission. The fact that he did not take. He asked. Her silence was answer enough. His fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, careful as falling snow. "These will fade," he said. "But what happened to you will not be forgotten." She flinched at the truth of it, then held still when he did not look away. "Good," she whispered before she could stop herself. He studied her, and something in the line of his mouth softened. "Good." "Yes," she said, voice trembling but honest. "If it is forgotten, it can happen again." The Alpha King went still. Then he nodded once, as if she had just spoken the kind of truth that kings rarely heard clearly. Below them, the garden stirred in the wind, and sunlight spread farther across the stone as if the day itself were leaning closer to listen. Far behind them, the palace bells began to ring the late morning hour. The sound moved through the halls like a declaration. The Omega did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know whether the world outside these walls would accept what the palace had begun to protect. But standing there in the warm light, with the Alpha King beside her and the garden breathing below, she felt something new settle in her chest. Not certainty. Not yet. But a fragile belief, quiet and dangerous in its own way, that being seen had not ended her. It had begun to restore her. The morning after the garden walk did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with work. By first light, the palace had quietly changed its shape around her, not in stone or in silence, but in the way people moved. Servants who had once looked through her now lowered their eyes with careful respect. Nobles who had spoken too loudly the day before now paused before entering a corridor where she might be seen. The Omega noticed every small shift, though she pretended not to. She had learned that hope could feel fragile enough to break if held too tightly. Still, when a maid brought fresh water and set it beside her with a bowed head, something warm and disbelieving stirred in her chest. It was such a simple thing. A cup. A lowered gaze. A room in which she was no longer treated like a mistake. In the late morning, the Alpha King asked for her to join him in the eastern wing, where the sun reached the marble windows in soft gold bands. He was not seated on the high throne then. He stood by a table covered in maps and sealed letters, one hand resting near the edge as though he had been there for hours. When she entered, he looked up at once. Not with surprise. Not with assessment. Just with quiet attention, and the steady calm of someone who had already decided she belonged in the room. "You slept?" he asked. The question was simple, but it landed gently, almost awkwardly, as though he was still learning how to speak to her without turning everything into an order. "A little," she said. Her voice was softer than she meant it to be. He studied her face, then the faint shadow beneath her eyes, and his brow tightened. Not enough. She did not answer. There was no need. He already seemed to understand that rest did not come easily to someone who had spent so long waiting to be sent away. He turned back to the table and slid a folded document toward her. These are the names of the households that will provide aid to the lower district this week, he said. I want you to see them before I approve anything. She stared at the page. Her fingers did not move at first. Me? Yes. Why? The Alpha King looked at her for a long moment, and in that stillness, she saw something rare in him. Not pity. Not performance. Trust. Because you noticed what others ignored, he said. Because you know what it is to need help and be denied it. And because I do not want decisions made for this palace without someone in this room who understands what it costs to be forgotten. Her breath caught. The words were not grand, but they felt heavier than a vow. She lowered her gaze to the page, careful not to let the sudden ache in her throat show. The names were written in neat black ink. House after house. Tithes, supplies, food, blankets, lantern oil. It was the language of power, but also of mercy, and for the first time, she was being invited to read it. Not as decoration. Not as charity. As judgment. As voice. She traced one line with her eyes, then another, and noticed a district marked for winter storage had been listed with too little grain. This one will not last through the cold month, she said before she could stop herself. The Alpha King went still. Why? Because the supply count is too low, she said, gaining steadiness as she spoke. And because the road there floods first. If the wagons are delayed even once, they will lose what little they have. He looked at the page, then at her again. Something unreadable passed through his expression, but it was not displeasure. It was recognition. Then we will revise it, he said at once. She blinked. Just like that? A faint flicker touched his mouth, almost a smile. Was there a reason not to? She did not have one. Not a real one. But she knew enough of palace life to expect argument, pride, delay. Instead, he called for the steward and spoke with calm authority, changing the order before the ink had even dried in her mind. No one challenged him. No one questioned why the Omega beside him was the one who had spotted the flaw. She only stood there, still and stunned, as the room moved around her like the first breath after a storm. When the steward left, the Alpha King turned back to her. There will be more decisions like that, he said. If you are willing. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the document. Fear rose first, automatic and familiar. It whispered that mistakes would make them regret ever trusting her. But beneath it, something braver answered. I am willing, she said. The words were barely above a breath, yet they seemed to change the air between them. He held her gaze, and this time his expression softened in a way that made her chest ache with an emotion she did not yet know how to name. Not triumph. Not possession. Something quieter. Something that looked like relief. Good, he said. Then we begin there. Outside the window, the palace gardens swayed under a clean American morning sky, the kind that promised heat by noon and gold by evening. Somewhere beyond the walls, the lower district was waking to another day of thin meals and hard work and too much survival. But inside the eastern wing, a different future had started to take shape, one careful decision at a time. The Omega looked again at the papers in her hands, then at the man beside her who had given her more than shelter. He had given her a place where her eyes could matter. And for the first time, she understood that being chosen was not only about being protected. It was also about being trusted to help build something that would last. The thought settled in her like a small, steady flame. Not loud. Not blazing. But real. By midday, the palace had begun to feel less like a place that watched her and more like a place that was learning how to make room for her. The Omega stood beside the long table in the eastern wing, her hands resting lightly on the edge of a stack of ledgers while the Alpha King spoke with the head steward about repairs, food orders, and the lower district families who had gone too long without support. He did not speak over her. He did not decide for her. He kept glancing at her as if her opinion belonged in the room as much as his own. And each time he did, she felt the same quiet ache rise in her chest, a kind of disbelief she had not yet learned how to lay down. "If the storehouse is going to be opened," she said at last, careful but steady, "then the deliveries should begin before the afternoon heat. The families closest to the river will wait in the sun the longest." The steward blinked, then looked to the Alpha King as if expecting correction. Instead, the king gave a slight nod. "Then we move the schedule," he said. "And we start with the river homes." It was such a small thing. Just a sentence. Just a change in timing. But the Omega saw the way the steward straightened, the way a servant near the doorway quietly looked up in surprise, the way the idea of her voice being taken seriously moved through the room like a warm current. It did not erase what had happened before. Nothing could do that. But it began to carve a different shape through the hurt. By late afternoon, she was no longer standing at the table. She was seated beside it, reviewing names with the old clerk while the king stood near the window, one hand behind his back, listening in the way only a man with power could listen when he was choosing patience over command. Outside, the gardens glowed under a soft American sun, bright and clean and almost too beautiful to match the quiet work happening inside. The palace servants moved more carefully now, not from fear alone, but from respect that was beginning to settle into them like dust after a storm. One young maid brought her fresh tea without being asked. Another placed a folded shawl over the back of her chair when the air turned cool. These were not grand gestures. They were smaller than grand. That was what made them matter. The Omega kept her gaze on the papers, but she felt the king's eyes on her more than once. Not with the hard intensity of possession. With something gentler. Something that seemed to ask, "Are you all right in this moment?" And for the first time, she found that she could almost answer yes. Almost. Because healing never arrived all at once. It came in tiny permissions. In warm tea. In an open chair. In being asked instead of ordered. In a room that no longer felt dangerous simply because she had entered it. As evening approached, the Alpha King led her down a quieter corridor toward the West Gallery, where old portraits lined the walls and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and rain drifting in from the courtyard. He stopped beside a tall window and looked out toward the horizon. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want you to meet the district council." Her breath caught, just slightly. "Me?" He turned to her, his expression calm and certain. "You know what they need. You hear what others miss. I am not asking you to stand behind me anymore." The words landed softly, but they changed everything. The Omega looked up at him, and in his face she saw no joke, no test, no hidden edge. Only trust. It frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. But she nodded. Slowly. Carefully. "Then I will come," she said. A faint smile touched his mouth, brief as sunlight on water. "Good," he murmured. "Because the palace is only the beginning. The rest of the kingdom will have to learn what I already know." She did not ask him what that was. She already knew the answer. That she was not a burden. Not a mistake. Not a girl to be hidden in shadow and blamed for surviving. She was someone worth listening to. Someone worth protecting. Someone worth building a future around. And as night gathered beyond the glass, the Omega stood beside the Alpha King in the quiet gold of the gallery, her shoulders a little straighter than before, her heart still tender but no longer alone. The world had not become kind overnight. But it had begun to change its mind. And that was how every beautiful ending started. The first snow of the season touched the palace roofs at dawn, turning every stone soft and silver as if the kingdom itself had finally learned how to breathe quietly. In the upper gallery, the Omega stood beside the Alpha King, her hand resting over the moon brooch at her chest while the court gathered below in a hush that felt almost sacred. No one was laughing now. No one was whispering. They had come because they had heard the news, and they had come because they could not bear to miss the moment the king had promised to speak. He looked at her once, and in that glance she felt every long night of fear begin to loosen. Not vanish. Not disappear like magic. But loosen, little by little, as though his certainty had reached into the dark places inside her and found them worthy of light. When the doors opened, the hall below rose in a slow wave of bows. The same faces that had once looked through her now waited for her to stand beside him. She felt the old instinct to shrink, to fold herself smaller, to become the girl who had learned to survive by asking for as little space as possible. But the Alpha King did not let that happen. He offered her his arm, steady and unhurried. She took it. Together they descended the stairway, and every step felt like a bruise healing in real time. At the bottom, the king faced the assembled court and spoke with a calm that carried farther than a shout ever could. This kingdom will not be built on fear, he said. And it will not be ruled by cruelty dressed as tradition. The room remained silent, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of humiliation. The silence of reckoning. He turned slightly, just enough for the whole hall to see her beside him. She is not here because I took pity on her. She is here because she is worthy of every place she stands in. The Omega felt the words settle through her like warm rain. Around them, heads lowered. Some with shame. Some with awe. Some with the unmistakable weight of realizing they had been wrong. The king did not soften his gaze. He did not need to. From this day forward, he said, any one of you who speaks to her with disrespect speaks against your own throne. A murmur moved through the court, small and trembling, and then stopped. He reached for her hand and lifted it only enough for the people to see the moon brooch at her heart and the strength in her fingers. And if any of you still do not understand, he added, his voice low and clear, then watch closely. This woman has already changed this kingdom more than most of you ever will. The Omega did not cry. Not because she did not feel the tears rising, but because something steadier had grown where tears once lived. She looked out over the faces below and did not see enemies anymore. She saw witnesses. People who had been given a chance to learn what she had been forced to know too early, that dignity was not something the powerful handed down. It was something every soul carried, even when the world tried to bury it. Later, when the court had emptied and the great hall had grown quiet again, they walked together into the winter garden. Frost glimmered on the branches, and the air smelled like earth waiting for spring. The Alpha King stopped beside the stone fountain, where moonlight pooled in the water like spilled silver. Are you afraid? He asked, not because he doubted her, but because he always asked her the truth. She thought about it. Then she gave him a small, honest smile. Yes, she said. But not of you. Something bright and almost unbearably tender moved across his face. He reached up and touched the edge of her brooch, careful as if it were something holy. Good, he murmured. Because I never wanted your trust to be a cage. Only a place to rest. The words made her chest ache in the sweetest way. She stepped closer, and this time she did not hesitate when he folded his cloak around her shoulders. It was not a gesture meant to hide her. It was a promise meant to keep. Beyond the garden walls, the kingdom waited for spring, for healing, for whatever came next. But here, in the quiet where snow met stone and the moon watched over them both, the Omega understood that her story had not been about surviving his world. It had been about helping change it. The king looked at her as if he had finally found the future he had been searching for all along. And when he spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. Stay with me, he said. She leaned into him, feeling his steady warmth, the life of him, the promise of him. I already am, she answered. So they stood together under the pale winter sky, no longer king and burden, no longer power and shame, but two hearts that had found each other at the edge of ruin and chosen, at last, to build something beautiful. And in that quiet, beneath the silver light of morning, the kingdom began to believe in mercy.